So here's how to use the cumulative relative frequency mathematical treatment into a visual using Microsoft Power BI. So if you see on the left side of my dashboard, I have here my table where I have weight and then the frequencies of each weight from my data set, and then I also have the relative frequency and the cumulative relative frequency. And as you can see, I use this into my into my visual here. This is called an ogive curve, but in Microsoft Power BI, I actually use the line chart. So before we get into the details on how this is made, let us go first over on how to make the data set for this. So this is a view of my dataset in Excel. So as you can see here, I have two columns, one for the weight. So each of these are weights in kilograms, and my frequency for each of the corresponding weights. And you see here that I have two more columns that will be displayed in Excel, but we will go over how to make them in Power BI. But these two columns are just the relative frequencies and then the cumulative relative frequency. And below you can see here the total of all the frequencies, because this is how we're going to be making the relative frequency. Because this is just getting the frequency divided by the total, and all of them will have the same formula. And then the cumulative relative frequency, they are simply just the relative frequencies, the sum of previous relative frequencies, and these must get to 1.00 or 100%. So let's go over how we're going to make this in Power BI. So I'm just going to make a new page so that we can go over step by step how to do this. So let's just call this sample, right? And we want to know how to get the data. So let's delete this data, and then let's go to get data and then get it from Excel, because that's where we're going to get it. Now that we've loaded it in Power BI, we want to transform this data first. So we want to chop off some of the data that we will not be using. So inside our Power Query Creator, we're going to be deleting these two columns, and we'll be deleting the last three rows. Here we go. So these two are the only columns that we'll be needing for this data set. So we'll do close and apply, and then now we have the two columns over here. So first, let me show you how this is made. You can see that if I show you my table, I have the frequency and the weight. So let me just rearrange these two. If I may just rearrange these two. So for the next step, we're going to be creating a new column for our relative frequencies. So if we're going to go over here, we'll click the new column button in Power BI. Then we'll just name the column RF for relative frequency. Then this is just simply frequencies divided by the sum of all frequencies in the dataset. If we press OK, then we'll include that new column into our table. Then you can see it here, labeled as RF. Then, if we're going to be creating the cumulative relative frequency column, we're just going to do new measure in Power BI. Then we'll call this CRF for cumulative relative frequency. Then we're going to be calculating this as, so it's going to be the sum of all relative frequencies, where, so for our filter, we'll just use the filter, okay, and then we'll filter all of the weights where the weight is less than or equal to the max of weights. There we go. Just press OK. Then we can just include this new column, the new column CRF, into our dataset. So if you notice here in CRF, the numbers are actually increasing, because it's a running total of the relative frequencies in the table. So note that this will only work if your data label column or your label column, so for in our case is weight, it's sorted in a certain order. So up to you if you want it to be ascending or descending. Additionally, we can also change how we view the cumulative relative frequency. If we go over here to the fields column or to the fields tab in our visualizations, so we can show the value as, instead of no calculation, we can select percent of grand total, and we will see here that it is actually going to show as a cumulative total or running total to 100%. So if we're going to be applying this into a visual, so for example, a line chart, or if we're going to be creating an ogive chart from this, let me just increase the size. So if I'm going to be selecting the weights and then the cumulative relative frequency, then I can just rearrange this to ascending. You can see here that as you go over to the weight, the cumulative relative frequency will also increase. We can modify this to show it as a grand total as well. And as you can see here, so from 75%, you can see that it takes up only the relative frequency is 1.41%. And then as you go higher and higher, the cumulative relative frequency will increase. And knowing the relative frequency of each data point is simply just getting how high did the cumulative relative frequency increase from one weight to another. And this is how you create a cumulative relative frequency in Power BI given just two columns, your data column and then your frequency column. And you can also create a visual using Power BI and just some few calculations. Hope you learned something.